Hello everyone, today we read and comment the second paragraph of the first chapter of the sixth book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being Advantages of the Defensive. The text follows. What is the object of defense? To preserve. To preserve is easier than to acquire, from which follows at once that the means on both sides being supposed equal, the defensive is easier than the offensive. But in what consists the greater facility of preserving or keeping possession? In this, that all time which is not turned to any account falls into the scale in favor of the defense. He reaps where he has not sowed. Every suspension of offensive action, either from erroneous views, from fear, or from indolence, is in favor of the side acting defensively. The advantage saved the state of Prussia from ruin more than once in the 7 Years' War. It is one which derives itself from the conception and object of the defensive, lies in the nature of all defense, and in ordinary life, particularly in legal business, which bears so much resemblance to war, it is expressed by the Latin proverb, Beati sunt possidentes. Another advantage arising from the nature of war and belonging to it exclusively is the aid afforded by locality or ground. This is one of which the defensive form has a preferential use. Having established these general ideas, we now turn more directly to the subject. In tactics, every combat, great or small, is defensive if we leave the initiative to the enemy and wait for his appearance in our front. From that moment forward, we can make use of all offensive means without losing the said two advantages of the defense, namely that of waiting for and that of ground. In strategy, at first, the campaign represents the battle, and the theater of war the position, but afterwards the whole war takes place of the campaign, and the whole country that of the theater of war, and in both cases the defensive remains that which it was in tactics. It has already been observed in a general way that the defensive is easier than the offensive. But as the defensive has a negative object, that of preserving, and the offensive a positive object, that of conquering, and as the latter increases our own means of carrying on war, but the preserving does not, therefore, in order to express ourselves distinctly, we must say that the defensive form of war is in itself stronger than the offensive. This is the result we have been desirous of arriving at, for although it lies completely in the nature of the thing, and has been confirmed by experience 1,000 times, still it is completely contrary to prevalent opinion, a proof of how ideas may be confused by superficial writers. If the defensive is the stronger form of conducting war, but has a negative object, it follows of itself that we must only make use of it so long as our weakness compels us to do so, and that we must give up that form as soon as we feel strong enough to aim at the positive object. Now, as the state of our circumstances is usually improved in the event of our gaining a victory through the assistance of the defensive, it is therefore also the natural course in war to begin with the defensive and to end with the offensive. It is therefore just as much in contradiction with the conception of war to suppose the defensive the ultimate object of the war, as it was a contradiction to understand passivity to belong to all the parts of the defensive, as well as to the defensive as a whole. In other words, a war in which victories are merely used to ward off blows, and where there is no attempt to return the blow, would be just as absurd as a battle in which the most absolute defense, passivity, should everywhere prevail in all measures. Against the justice of this general view, many examples might be quoted in which the defensive continued defensive to the last, and the assumption of the offensive was never contemplated, but such an objection could only be urged if we lost sight of the fact that here the question is only about general ideas, abstract ideas, and that examples in opposition to the general conception we are discussing are all of them to be looked upon as cases in which the time for the possibility of offensive reaction had not yet arrived. In the 7 Years' War, at least in the last 3 years of it, Frederick the Great did not think of an offensive. Indeed, we believe further that generally speaking he only acted on the offensive at any time in this war as the best means of defending himself. His whole situation compelled him to this course, and it is natural that a general should aim more immediately at that which is most in accordance with the situation which he is placed for the time being. Nevertheless, we cannot look at this example of a defense upon a great scale without supposing that the idea of a possible counterstroke against Austria lay at the bottom of the whole of it, and saying to ourselves, the moment for that counterstroke had not arrived before the war came to a close. The conclusion of peace shows that this idea is not without foundation, even in this instance. For what could have actuated the Austrians to make peace except the thought that they were not in a condition, with their own forces alone, to make head the talent of the king, that to maintain an equilibrium their exertions must be greater than heretofore, and that the slightest relaxation of their efforts would probably lead to fresh losses of territory. And in fact, who can doubt that if Russia, Sweden, and the army of the German Empire had ceased to act together against Frederick the Great, he would have tried to conquer Austrians again in Bohemia and Moravia? Having thus defined the true meaning of the defensive, having defined its boundaries, we return again to the assertion that the defensive is the stronger form of making war. Upon a closer examination and comparison of the offensive and defensive, this will appear perfectly plain, but for the present we shall confine ourselves to noticing the contradiction in which we should be involved with ourselves and with the results of experience by maintaining the contrary to be the fact. If the offensive form was the stronger, there would be no further occasion even to use the defensive. As it has merely a negative object, every one would be for attacking, and the defensive would be an absurdity. On the other hand, it is very natural that the higher object should be purchased by greater sacrifices. Whoever feels himself strong enough to make use of the weaker form has it in his power to aim at the greater object. Whoever sets before himself the smaller object can only do so in order to have the benefit of the stronger form. If we look to experience, such a thing is unheard of, as any one carrying on a war upon two different theaters, offensively on one with a weaker army, and defensively on the other with his strongest force. But if the reverse of this has everywhere and at all times taken place, that shows plainly that generals, although their inclination prompts them to the offensive, still hold the defensive to be the stronger form. We have still in the next chapters to explain some preliminary points. So, beautiful paragraph in here that dwells a bit more in depth with the relation between attack and defense, and why the defensive, as we've seen in the previous paragraph and also previously during in the previous books, is the strongest form of war, albeit with a negative object. So, Vom Kriege says, what is the object of defense, in fact? So, these are like the ABCs of the Vom Kriege, so it's very important to get them right. So, what is the object of defense? We've already seen it, but here it's explicitated. It's fundamentally to preserve, right? We've seen in the previous paragraph that here the defensive is fundamentally characterized by the state of expectancy of, or waiting for a blow to arrive, and naturally, defense is supposed to ward off a blow implicitly, so it's not a merely passive defense, right? You cannot tend toward that, but at the end of the day, you're never there not to pass on the offensive on a smaller scale. And as we already explained this, also, and von Clausewitz points here out, says, still war without a counter attack, it's not conceivable fundamentally. In practice, for a number of reasons we will be seeing, especially when we're talking about the attack, but it's intuitive, right? You can't fundamentally fight a war thinking, I just defend, right? And let the enemy simply, exhaust in itself, and without thinking of, having this major opportunity of counterattacking, so the enemy maybe is enough weakened to annihilate him further and to have a greater, advantage. in the following political stance, right? So, but as we'll see it better. So, what is the objective of defense? To preserve, right? And to preserve, from Clausewitz says, is easier than to acquire, which is pretty easy to understand. In order to acquire, you have to spend energies. In order to preserve, at least you have to spend less, right? On average. Von Clausewitz says, from which follows at once that the means on both sides being supposed equal, right, which is obviously abstract, but it still makes the point, the defensive is easier than the offense. That's why, right? And always remember this in the Vom Kriege, there's a double threat, of course. Theory doesn't mean abstraction, right? Here, the supposition that both sides are equal is an abstraction, but it's a mathematical, physical evidence. So whatever things are gonna go, tendentially this is true, right? Then things can vary wildly. So never think even for a second that Vom Kriege tells you, after all, it's in every instance it's better to defend or to attack. This goes, this has nothing to do with what this work is about, right? We have to understand though what such things are said. In fact, albeit the defensive is easier than the offensive, Clausewitz says, but in what consists the greater facility of preserving or keeping possession? In this, that all time which is not turned to any account falls into the scale in favor of the defense. Right? He reaps where he has not sowed. Every suspension of offensive action, either from erroneous offensive action, either from erroneous views, from fear or from indolence, is in favor of the side acting defensively. This is obvious. We have seen this in the paragraphs commenting on the suspension of the act of war, which is a normal occurrence. Most of war is spent doing nothing practically, and this does advantage the defender, right? Because he has time to gather more forces, whereas that the attacker, in order to cope with that, has automatically to do more, because physically he has to at least get there and overcome something greater, right? So this tendentially brings to always the advantage, and this occurrence, as we've seen, is normal. So in real war, this is amplified normally. Von Clausewitz says, this advantage saved the state of Prussia, for example, from ruin more than once in the 7 Years' War. It is one which derives itself from the conception and object of the defensive, lies in the nature of all defense, and in ordinary life, particularly in legal business, which bears so much resemblance to war, and it is expressed by the Latin proverb Beati sunt possidentes, which is pretty clear, right? It's even thinking about war in general, historically, who is normally the most advantaged, aside from attack or defense? Obviously the richest, right? The richer, and who can have already a substantial amount of resources under his command, right? Great states have capacity to develop on their own, even if they're more messed up systems that are in a way less predictable to control, but still they have, because they have more resources, right? And they can implement themselves. States that are either countries that are either dominated by others or do not have much of a statal development always lag behind, but consistently, structurally, by scale, right? Von Clausewitz says, another advantage arising from the nature of war and belonging to it exclusively is the aid afforded by locality or ground, because von Clausewitz says this is one of which the defensive form has a preferential use, which is pretty obvious. The fact that, as we were saying before, the attacker has to get somewhere, spatially speaking, and that consumes energies, and countering ground create this friction as well that consumes the attackers, more resources. The attacker has to find somewhere, right? He has, in a way, to struggle with this local impediments that do create complications. We have seen all the supplying problems and how these can assume a real strategical value, right? Not in the logistical art per se, but in the fact, in the relation with the local politics and society, That's how the thing is done at the end of the day. So then von Clausewitz says, having established these general ideas, we now turn more directly to the subject. In tactics, every combat, great or small, is defensive if we leave the initiative to the enemy and wait for his appearance in our front. From that moment forward, we can make use of all offensive means without losing the said two advantages of the defense, namely that of waiting for and that of ground. Because you're essentially shooting at the enemy at enough, at range, and you are, he's still advancing at that point has already advanced, so they're already worn out, and is skipping to probably also has lost more order than you did, staying waiting for him there. So it's something that shifts the balance in your favor. Then maybe it's not enough, it's not decisive, but this is not important because that depends on whichever the situation is. But that thing physically always happens, right? So that's why here we're talking in abstract, but not so much abstract terms at the end of the day. Abstract just for the positivity of the advice of whether using attack or defense. But in practice, this happens all the times. Really, but not necessarily decisively for combat. In strategy, von Clausewitz says, at first the campaign represents the battle, and the theater of war the position. But afterwards the whole war takes the place of the campaign, and the whole country that of the theater of war. And in both cases the defensive remains that which it was in tactics. So it has been already observed in a general way that the defensive is easier than the offensive. But as the defensive has a negative object, that of preserving, and the offensive a positive object, that of conquering, and as the latter increases our own means of carrying on the war, but the preserving does not. Therefore, in order to express ourselves distinctly, we must say that the defensive form of war is in itself stronger than the offensive. Right? This is the result we have been desirous of arriving at, for although it lies completely in the nature of the thing and has been confirmed by experience 1,000 times, still it is completely contrary to prevalent opinion, a proof how ideas may be confused by superficial writers. So this aspect now will clarify it better. That is to say, war, has always this dichotomy, as you understand, of attack and defense, which always switches, right? It goes often back and forth, both tactically and strategically for both sides. But the point here is assessing the fact that the defensive form of war has a negative object. That is to say, it doesn't actually aim at increasing your own resources. How? As we've seen that fundamentally it's easier to defend than to attack. Well, because the attack has a positive object in the measure of achieving something that will provide you eventually with a greater amount of resources. This is why we're talking of a real world, because if it was an abstraction, you would simply say, well, it's simply based on a measure of force. The attacker would just calculate mathematically what to crush like a defense like, but there is that intrinsic advantage. It would be a kind of a mathematical addition or subtraction. Here it's different, because in war, naturally that object, first of all, is, it always varies. We will see it with the concept of Schwerpunkt in the first place, but fundamentally it does aim at something that the enemy probably realizes, right, and that is preventing you from attaining. But that goes beyond, at that point, the intrinsic advantage of the offensive and the defensive. It is true that this does approximate tendentially to the same ratio of strength between two armies, and this is true especially the larger the armies are. But at the same time, the attack is justified exactly by this, that it can be a gamble that can make you win a lot more than what actually the annihilation, the physical annihilation of the enemy simply is from a face-to-face confrontation. Now this may sound a bit foggy as a concept, but it's actually very important, because von Clausewitz actually uses it for getting to the point that still the defensive form of war is in itself stronger than the offense. That is, it prevents this more easily than the attacker usually can get. So this actually explains how motivated attackers are to obtain an objective, and how, in that sense, war, the offensive has a positive point, because it does really aim at making a difference. It's not a try, right? The defensive intrinsically is limited in a way by the options that it takes, because the attack can be more risky for one matter, but at the end of the day is what you have to carry out at one point if you want to finally get rid in this most smashing form the enemy, and that can be obtained exactly with aiming at an objective that goes beyond the mere disadvantage that is provided by a static conception, or a static or moving conception of war. We'll see this better, but this is extremely important, right? Still, von Clausewitz says, at the end of the day, however, defense does remain more advantageous most of the times. It's just that for that reason that the attacker went on with the offensive, that is fundamentally just letting him still act, right, for achieving his result, and given that he is aware naturally of the disadvantage by this realization, still evidently has the reason for carrying that out, given the odds, right, and what separates him from from attaining his victory. I know I may not be completely clear here, but we'll see this better at some point. And von Clausewitz here is actually polemizing against those who still believe that attack was fundamentally the stronger form of war, because especially in Prussia they thought that since, as we'll see now, Frederick the Great had mostly, how it was during 7 Years' War, Prussia was risking to be wiped out from a moment to another, because it couldn't, in terms of static power of that possessores, which von Clausewitz was pointing out, of course it couldn't compare with Russia, with France, with Austria, right? It was a second category power. So its first move to save its own skin was immediately to invade Saxony, right, and then passing on the offense, right? But the point, as von Clausewitz was explaining here, was naturally, if it had been possible to defend, in that case it wasn't possible to defend, right, because they had less than the others, so they had to find the result with a more they had to find an objective with a more positive result in order to achieve more, right? Because if they had the numbers, of course they would have remained in the defensive, or maybe passing on the offensive with a crushing superiority on a neighboring scale somewhere else, which is actually what Prussia did towards Saxony. It was even a less important power. So that is that exemplifies, as von Clausewitz points out, the relativity of these choices, and always consider that von Clausewitz in all this, by thinking that defense is the stronger form of war, doesn't at all think that tangentially wars should be defensive. He thinks quite the opposite. He says, if anything, it's better to attack, right? If that's your point, if your motivation is so high to say, okay, well, I can't take this risk, well, that's up to you, of course, but that is what will, with the necessary determination, make the thing done, because the thing is so important to overcome even the disadvantage of the attack relatively to over defense. Well, still that means you have a greater motive that is tendentially represents your greater moral strength at that point, and which especially aims at getting the thing done as quickly as possible. This is possibly the most important thing in there, because the defensive doesn't care. The defensive, for the simple fact of leaving the initiative to the enemy, saying, okay, let's make this continue. Let's make the guy advance, do whatever you want, inflict damage, whatever. From our side, maintaining his troops on the field and seeing what happens. So lengthening the time, and that may be advantages at the time. In fact, from Clausewitz now will say something like, if attack was possible all the time, everybody would be attacking. So it's not like that, and that's why defense is the stronger form of war, yet with a negative object, which is actually what would make it theoretically less advisable in the first place. And also leaving the initiative to the enemy, by the way, allows him, as we've seen, to gain that greater advantage in other ways that if we don't stop him, therefore passing to the offensive ourselves, he can probably match us. So do you understand how it works more or less? It's really simple, telling you the truth, and it should, if you just to help yourself maybe thinking about it better, you should always think that this state of defense and attack are always reversible, and they get always reversed. And as we have seen, by scale, we're always either attacking or defending in some way, right? This is extremely important to understand. And the example, in fact, von Clausewitz makes for Prussia during the 7 Years' War is pretty spot on. And here he's correcting those thinkers that essentially believe that instead it's attack the stronger form, right? And von Clausewitz says, if the defensive is the stronger form of conducting war but has a negative object, it follows of itself that we must only make use of it so long as our weakness compels us to do so, and that we must give up that form as soon as we feel strong enough to aim at the positive object, right? So, in other words, if defense was something, sclerotic, stuck, you're just defending, you're doing nothing. Just let the enemy come at us. Well, first of all, if he's at dramatic disadvantage, if he just had to come to fight you, he won't do that. He will probably do something else. He will get passed around you. Will try to take out your your lines of defense. So you will be forced at that point to attack, as we just said. But more importantly, as we've seen also in the paragraph about the exploitation, let's say, of victory by inflicting the heavier blow on the enemy, of course you have all the interest in war, especially when the enemy, when the advantage of your own, of the enemy defense is lower than your attacking one. You should be passing on the offensive, and this is because that will allow you to maybe wipe out the enemy, and therefore not simply making him attack you and wear himself out, and partly you too in the process. Of course, this depends on how relative that advantage is. That is, that allows you to crush him devastatingly, yes, it can be better than remaining on the defensive, simply passively receiving the enemy, right? At the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying in war practically. I mean, in theory, we're just forcing the enemy to fulfill our will. Practically, as we've seen also being demonstrated with Vom Kriege, we're literally exterminating the guy. We have to kill its own armed forces, right? That's the way it passes through. So what is also important to remember is that this dichotomy between attack and defense, in reality, is not really a matter of opinion. Of course, there is a decisional process that, in the most important ones, is, is difficult to take for a number of reasons. At that point, are not just even military, right? We'll make a video soon, perhaps, about, Caesar and Pompey, and given that some of you even asked me about Pompey after the last video on Caligula, that illustrates actually this part very well. But let's say the more he who has to attack or defend doesn't realize he has to do it when the balance has shifted, and the more disadvantage will ensue for him, right? And history hopefully will remember that, and it does show it, in fact, dramatically in the military annals. So, in other words, even though, of course, there's not a mechanistic, equation for which in war everybody understands whether to pass on defensive or defensive all the time, and believe me, that's a hell of a difficult decision sometimes, still, events do follow, consequently, because the advantage here, or disadvantage, respectively, cannot be eliminated. This is the point von Clausewitz is making. That thing is gonna ensue. Because if you don't pass to counter-attack when the enemy is weak enough, is retreating, for example, you've just let your enemy go away. Well, you could have factually crushed him. And von Clausewitz has explained to us that even the idea of expecting or non-expecting that has a strategic weight, because you're effectively basing your own decisions, even on this, abstract, not abstract, but, still not real thing, such as an expectation, but that still, in terms of decision and what follows from it, does make a huge difference. In other words, every fight, von Clausewitz says, is thought, right? So the decision of you attacking or not attacking the enemy is based on the imaginary reality of what will happen whether you attack or you don't attack. That has a real strategical weight in reality, because that's what is going to make the difference. So at the end of the day, this dichotomy, however, especially the larger war is, right, and the more is exemplified, right? That is, tendentially, the smallest the clashes are, and the most bizarre the results, right? The larger the armies, the larger the clash, the least you can literally do, right? The decision can become more crushing, and that's why it's also the riskiest, the boldest point, but it's also the most decisive, because at the end of the day, it's gonna, the mistakes are gonna create, in absolute terms, a larger damage, and that is naturally shifting the strategical balance in a way. So this is extremely important to understand, right? Because war is always made in two. There are laws of reciprocity here, so nothing that happens to you or your enemy doesn't reflect on one another, because it's always intertwined. You're there to knock each other out. That's all what war is, right? So these things do make always a difference. And von Clausewitz says, of course, in reality, nobody fights just on the defensive. The objective is passing on defensive. It's kind of obvious. Always remember this as a duel, even as a brawl, right? Don't think that war is fundamentally different. It's the same thing. Von Clausewitz teaches us that war is nothing but a duel on a large scale. What's the point of just defending? Right? In the theory, we'll say, well, about self-defense, yes, but that's caused by other political, we could say in Clausewitzian terms, issues. That is to say, of course, a greater reason that has nothing to do with the fight in itself. But if you wanted that guy, extrapolated of any other concern, a moral scruple, whatever, if you just wanted to prevent the other guy doing that again, of course, if you had the possibility of killing him, why not? If that had no consequence politically and socially, what you want in a ferocious, primitive, instinctive struggle is just to smash the guy. Not just you're attacked, we're triggered naturally, and that's also why we sanction excessive defense, exactly because we know it's counter-instinctive, but we have to discipline ourselves in that regard. Is when we are aggressed to be either to flee because we realize that may be the better option if we have no other way of doing it, or surrendering. Otherwise, if you have the possibility of striking back, yes, you can defend yourself momentarily, but then you will blow the hell out of that guy, and that's pretty normal because you're instinctively set on that ground, and that's what at the end of the day in war that is much less restricted than individual behavior by society and so on, because world out there's not really a police. Things do happen like that, and the larger the clashes are, the more brutal in that sense they become. And always remember that this has nothing to do with the moral reasons why you're fighting that war. Von Clausewitz fundamentally doesn't give a damn about that, because he's writing a work on the theory of the art of war to tell us how to win a war in the case we find ourselves in one. Then whichever the reason is for us, he doesn't care. It's up to your own conscience. This empowers you. It makes you realize how important this difference is. But he's just telling us that the proceedings of war, for that matter, if you really are interested in winning it and not, just going out there, not even knowing what to do, are not humane. Because the proceedings of war are not humane by definition. And that's why we kill each other. It's not a matter of evil. It's a matter of assessment of what reality is about. And you can't win a war if you decide to get in one, but doing these things. So fooling yourself that this is otherwise actually is counterproductive in humanitarian terms, because that will actually increase the amount of dead people for your inaction, and your, and very often by simply, remaining passive to the situation. That's why the defensive may be the strongest form of war, but first, it always entails you striking back in a way. Secondly, the fact that you should pass proper on the offensive at some point. And third, that if you properly don't do this, you will lose something, right? This will have caused more chances of war replicating itself, right, and going on and lengthening and causing other damage in absolute terms to people. This is ferocious. Yes, I do realize that, but this is why it's beautiful, because it tells you the thing as it is, and it is actually the way to make things good, even in humanitarian terms. This is what, of course, most people have no clue of, because, of course, they react instinctively, and they do not realize what evidence shows us and how war properly works. We could digress more on this, because at the end of the day, it gets down to this, right? The Vom Kriege is fundamentally about this realization. And then it shows you how, between this and reality, there's a huge amount of things you should know in the first place in order how to win the war. But at the core, all the logic of them stems from this realization. And it is counter-instinctive, right? War is counter-instinctive. Right? It never think those who say war is done because humans are just a bunch of primitive beasts who react instinctively. Instinctively, humans tend to flee from confrontation. Humans are designed genetically to just shout at each other, throw some rocks, and go away. War is something counter-instinctive as hell, because it goes against any instinct of self-preservation, which is totally human. At the same time, it's probably the most human thing in the sense that nobody else does it, because we do it thanks to reason, in fact, not to instinct. And this is of enormous importance in a person's culture, education, understanding to absorb, right? Because if you go out there in the world, and if you don't get this, you will basically get wrong any type of confrontation. As a consequence, you will just make it worse and more violent and more damage. But of course, if you say it out loud, it sounds just like, you're pro-war, which is not even what von Clausewitz says, in the sense that von Clausewitz says, war is most of the times actually not a great idea, right? This illustrates just what war is when something so messed up like getting at war happens, for you to care how even to fight it, because you may be sucked into it without even wanting that, and you must know how to defend yourself on that occasion, and others at the same time. So it's excruciatingly important to learn this stuff for a moral problem, saving other people's lives. Then von Clausewitz says, now, as the state of our circumstances is usually improved in the event of our gaining a victory through the assistance of the defensive, it is therefore also the natural course in war to begin with the defensive and to end with the offensive. This is also pretty clear, right? It is preferable, right, to be cautious at the beginning and then to attack. This is not a matter of saying, it's obvious that, as we've said before, that if one attacks, the other defends, and vice versa, right? But at the same time, given the suspension of the act of war during the same conduction of war, well, we realize that wars begin by observing right? Even the start of operations is not properly worth like considering it the beginning of war from out of the blue. Like it's like thinking, I don't know, think about the Nazis when they invaded the Soviet Union. I mean, they had planned it badly, but they had planned it, and therefore it's as if there was at a dual scale a guy gazing at the enemy and then passing on the offensive just then. This is how hybrid it is, the relation between politics and war, so in Clausewitzian terms, so that you understand that even in reality, had you attack one guy, you don't just go out there without thinking, without seeing the situation, without looking at the environment, without having any understanding of what is going on, and just to pass on the attack. You have to, nobody does that, right? So, but at the end of the day, what you think the end of the struggle is like to inflict the final blow, and that's it, right? So that's spot on. Yes, it's natural course in war to begin with the defensive and to end with the offensive. Yeah, I mean, even to begin with defensive, we've seen defensive is characterized by the expectation of getting one blow and warding off, right? So there is obviously in the quotient that makes you watch, gaze, the at least in potential, of course, the idea that you may be struck. So that is what makes the thing. If you wander, right, you don't just start by attacking. That's what, at the end of the day, is stopping you. It's really a gnosiological problem, not just a moral one, because you may want to attack and haven't gone there with all the intention, right? So you're loaded enough to do that, but you don't necessarily know what's the best circumstance to attack proper. So yeah, it's that simple. Von Clausewitz says, it is therefore just as much in contradiction with the conception of war to suppose the defensive the ultimate object of the war, as it was a contradiction to understand passivity to belong to all the parts of the defensive, as well as to the defensive as a whole, right? We explain it, but before say next phrase, in other words, so explanatorily enough, a war in which victories are merely used to ward off blows, and where there is no attempt to return the blow, would be just as absurd as a battle in which the most absolute defense, passivity, should everywhere prevail in all measures. So in other words, of course you're obliged to fight offensively and defensively at the same time. You can't think to finish a war by defending. This doesn't mean that it may not happen, because you don't know what's... Here we're talking from a single side, right? Because let's suppose the guy flees, and you were scared enough by his attack not to do much about that, and maybe because you couldn't, because you were too weak or you were wounded or whatever. So that explains pretty well how it can be, right? But tendentially, I mean, this is a relative reality, but tendentially, it should be the other way around, right? And chances are that even here it's realistic. I mean, if you can't strike back, why would the guy flee? You understand that paradox? It's what we were saying before, that in real war, most confrontations are about people that the odds of which are evenly balanced, because it's irrealistic that somebody would risk something so great if they thought they would be at disadvantage so much to lose it more easily, right? That's why eventually big powers rule in the world, because who would actually care to get annihilated by them? They're also cautious, of course, because there is a broader friction. It's not easy at all to maintain great power, but at the same time there's an intrinsic advantage in there, as von Clausewitz was saying by Beatis and Possidentes, that maintains more or less that state of things, right? But never underestimate in that regard even the don't think that war is just about that possession. Yes, resources are important, but moral ones are the greatest. So that is quite fluid. Who does have the greatest moral resources, and how does connect with the material ones? This is the physical way. That's very important to realize. So never be easy about war, because all wars that are fought, more or less, it's because somebody can, both have substantial chances to win them, and especially the greater they are. So doesn't matter how risky they get, right? Then the motives are difficult to teach, even just historically speaking, because it's easy to study the military operations. The question is, how do you start telling the history of the conflict that preceded it, and that, of course, continued within it and even after it, frankly, because it never stops. That's way more difficult, in a way. So at the same time, we've seen the other paradox is that, of course, there can't be properly a defense without the idea of warding off a blow, which does entail an offensive capacity at the same time. There's no mere passivity, right? And that's why also you can't project positivistically or deterministically a war by saying, okay, here I have a target, it's just passive, I can do whatever you want. Because the guy, as exposed as it is probably realizing that and taking countermeasures for you to have it more difficult, right? And it always happens like that, especially the largest the powers involved are. I mean, it's dramatically easy to, unfortunately, as events proved, to offend someone in the street, right? And for no reason, for stupid reason. It's way more difficult to fool a state, right? To say, okay, no, I don't want to attack you, but just you're preparing for war. That never happens. Historically speaking, wars are never flashing, right? You can't have a specific strategy or tactics that makes it more speedy. But politically speaking, everybody knows what the other is up to, right? And that's why crazy stuff almost never happens. That's also why wars are large bodies of people's responsibilities, right? They're not just one person that pushes the button, even if it came to that at some point. But part of the reason why we're still alive at this point is because of this tendency to realize what also the reality, right? The pragmatic reality is, and that it's not worth the end of the day to kill each other if the option is killing ourselves in the process, right? So it goes both ways, both when there is a great imbalance, both where there's no way through that. And Clausewitz says, against the justice of this general view, many examples may be quoted in which the defensive continued to the last, and the assumption of the offensive was never contemplated. But such an objection could only be urged if we lost sight of the fact that here the question is only about general ideas, abstract ideas, and that examples in opposition to the general conception we are discussing are all of them to be looked upon as cases in which the time for the possibility of offensive reaction had not yet arrived. Right? Here, it's important of the abstraction, because von Clausewitz is telling us, of course, there are situations in which you can't even counterattack. I mean, it's obvious. But the fact that you still can, that, let's say, there may be chances in which it's not convenient to the point of view realistically not doing it because you're not an idiot, but the option is always there, right? And things could always change politically, militarily. So this abstraction is not a real, let's say, abstraction. It actually speaks for always the possibility of you making a better or worse choice that very often is also not very easy to focus on. And also, here there is a matter of perspective, that is to say, which scale are you taking into consideration? I mean, where does this option end? Is it a tactical one? Is it a strategical one? Or is it a political one? Because it does make a huge difference, and now von Clausewitz will make an example of this, because it says, and that example is in opposition to the general conception we are discussing. We already said, it says, in the 7 Years' War, at least in the last 3 years of it, this is the example, Frederick the Great did not think of an offensive, practically, right? Indeed, we believe further that, generally speaking, he only acted on the offensive at any time in this war as the best means of defending himself, as we explained before, because Prussia needed to seize other countries to cope with the more powerful ones that were threatening her. And his whole situation compelled him to this course, and it is natural that a general should aim more immediately at that which is not in accordance with the situation in which he is placed for their time being. I mean, it's obvious that, as we were saying before, you will not do something that at the moment is not advantageous. But for you deciding that, obviously there is the chance, we were saying before, of doing it theoretically, and that is something that you have to decide at some point whether to turn into action or not. And in fact, Clausewitz says always about the Prussian example, nevertheless, we cannot look at this example, Frederick, of a defense upon a great scale without supposing that the idea of a possible counterstroke against Austria lay at the bottom of the whole of it. And saying to ourselves, the moment for that counterstroke had not arrived before the war came to a close, right? Because if, he had kept winning and winning, of course, why not getting to Vienna, right? But the chances for doing that, of course, were not present, and they didn't happen. But in other circumstances, they would. So that's where the abstraction becomes real, right? And Clausewitz says the conclusion of peace shows that this idea is not without foundation, even in this instance, right? Even the fact that to say, they stopped the operations, right? For what could have actuated the Austrians to make peace except the thought that they were not in a condition with their own forces alone to make head against the talent of the king, right? That to maintain an equilibrium their exertions must be greater than their heretofore, and that the slightest relaxation of their efforts would probably lead to fresh losses of territory, right? In that political agreement, of course, there is a negotiation. There is the realization that everybody has to win something, everybody has to lose something. And that at the end of the day, that happens because the balance is the one it is. But if it wasn't, the others wouldn't give them that peace, right? And there are enough historical examples to see why that's the case. And the reasons why these happen, of course, are causes of major force most of the times. But this doesn't eliminate the possibility, however, that at the end of the day, what you should be doing against somebody who is harassing you is knocking him out, preferably. Then there are other mitigating factors because, welcome to reality. But that dynamic is there. It's what leads the whole thing, and it cannot be excluded from the conduct of war, right? In fact, von Clausewitz says, and in fact, who can doubt that if Russia, Sweden, and the army of the German Empire had ceased to act together against Frederick the Great, he would have tried to conquer the Austrians again in Bohemia and Moravia? I mean, look at the miracles of the House of Brandenburg. That's what we're actually trying to do, right? And he would have been quite happy to push forward his own conquest as well, right? They were trying, of course, to knock out each other, but the real world put, some impediment to it. And this real world is so complicated that you can't say, it's something you can't, it's calculated. Of course, there are broader dynamics, like in that balance we can study historically speaking, but at the time, those things might have been easily overturned. I mean, Prussia could be eliminated easily at some point by the French, by the Russians. It didn't happen. Why? For political reasons, essentially, mixed with also with strategical ones and so on, but that would have been a completely different history, and who knows which other many, countries destroyed or saved would have happened historically if that had happened. So at the end of the day, that's the objective. That's how you see that. And it doesn't make any sense to pretend to say, okay, so since we studied the last 3 years of the 7 Years' War, and that was the case, okay, so we shouldn't just the ultimate objective is not pushing, rushing for the attack towards the end, because that's what would bring you to the final victory in absolute terms. Because in war, that is mitigated by every case. But the dynamic does bring you to start on the defensive and finish on the offensive, because it's in linear thought the most obvious thing to do, that we basically act out for, and that basically takes place also on a smaller scale, time after time, because this was the grand plan of things, let's say, but of how the war went. But at a strategical level, tactical level, you do find that. You do find people looking at that, staying in defense at some point, then attacking and crushing the enemy, and going fully on that, because that's how fundamentally you fight at the end of the day. Then von Clausewitz says, having thus defined the true meaning of the defensive, having defined its boundaries, we return again to the assertion that the defensive is the stronger form of making war. Upon a closer examination and comparison of the offensive and defensive, this will appear perfectly plain. We have listed the intrinsic advantages of defense before. But for the present, we shall confine ourselves to noticing the contradiction in which we should be involved with ourselves and with the results of experience, by maintaining the contrary to be the fact. If the offensive form was the stronger, there would be no further occasion ever to use the defensive, as it has merely a negative object. Everyone would be for attacking, and the defensive would be an absurdity. You understand why? Because you could say, well, not attack, because attack has a positive object. So, in any case, it would be justified, and that's why and how we fight wars objectively. But if the defensive was the weaker form of war, and having a negative object, I mean, why would you even defend? Right? You would be wiped out every time. It's not like that. Right? War shows that pretty obviously, with showing that intrinsic advantage that derives from defending, which tendentially means that naturally we tend to more to defend than to attack, of course, right? Even though we shouldn't, because as we've seen, attacking has the positive one, but that's the abstraction that goes against reality, not because reality contradicts it, but because it confirms it. You see there, the Vom Kriege is really simple at the end of the day. You say it many times, but it's counterintuitive. And the way you can see these things demonstrated is studying military history, because that's exactly what happens. In fact, von Clausewitz says, on the other hand, it is very natural that the higher object should be purchased by greater sacrifices. Hence the positivity of the attack. That is to say, of course you're attacking for gaining an advantage. You're not attacking for gaining a disadvantage. Right? And this is why it's more difficult to attack than defend. And that's why wars start in the first place at the root of it. Because what you can gain from it is greater than that disadvantage and pushes you to surpass it. Otherwise you wouldn't fight that. Right? If attack was the weakest form of war and had a negative purpose, then nobody would attack. Right? Just like if that was defense, as we have just seen. You start understanding how this whole thing works, right? It's crystalline clear. Von Clausewitz then says, whoever feels himself strong enough to make use of the weaker form has it in his power to aim at the greater object. That's the moral force. That's what pushes you to move up. And not to sit there idling and just waiting after somebody attacking you. Live in the initiative. There's somebody out there who's already working much harder than you can ever imagine. It's difficult. It does consume resources, but the investment can be far greater. That's also why von Clausewitz can bring to a much greater profit. That's why von Clausewitz also, by the way, believes that war does resemble to business in practice, because it does have this almost commercial, transactional, negotiational, I don't know how to say that, element to it. Whoever sets, he writes, before himself the smaller object can only do so in order to have the benefit of the stronger form. Isn't this beautiful as well? This is pure genius, right? You say, okay, you gain to get the easier way, but what are you gonna get after all? It's like in life. What are you willing to do for what you really care about? Most people don't do much at the end of the day. This doesn't mean that it's that, they obviously do it because they're lazy, because they think, okay, but now I don't want to sacrifice so much. Why? Because you don't you haven't properly acknowledged morally how much you could gain if you invested in a certain way. And it takes a lot of courage, in fact, moral resources, it takes a lot of vision, of intelligence, of determination. It's not easy. But if you spot rationally what's the best option, well, you should have enough determination too to pursue it, to make a real difference. Because otherwise, yes, you choose the easier way, but how much do you grow? That's why attack is preferential, in spite of the intrinsic disadvantage that it has most of the time, right? Most of the times, in meaning 50% plus 1 statistically, right? Not even factually. Von Clausewitz says, if we look to experience, such a thing is unheard of as anyone carrying on war upon two different theaters, offensively on one with a weaker army and defensively on the other with his strongest force. But if the reverse of this has everywhere and at all times taken place, that shows plainly that generals, although their own inclination prompts them to the offensive, still hold the defensive to be the stronger form. We have still in the next chapters to explain some preliminary points. So you see the point, what is here? Von Clausewitz says, even two theaters that can't be, can't even say battle, right? But it's obvious that, look at the Battle of the Marne in 1914, the Schlieffen Plan. They were boldly trying to make this massive outflanking of the French front and just maintain a few armies, at least in Alsace, right? And it failed. Why? Because tendentially that's what happens. Defensive is the strongest form. There, lots of things not considered. Was kind of absurd, but that, in fact, the practicity of war tells us that most of the times you contain the enemy, the bulk of your forces, and then just with a smaller force you try maybe to outflank him, to carry out some other complex maneuver, because tendentially attacking is riskier. So you want to risk less of your forces, right? And that's what reveals the intrinsic advantage. But at the same time, of defense over attack. But at the same time, that offensive can be skillfully managed in a way that can confer you something much greater than you would expect, and that's why you would use it in the first place. And that's why outflanking maneuvers tell me that I study 13th and first half 14th century warfare mostly, tell me how many times major battles were won, in fact, mostly by that. Lines crashing against each other, basically going on with this iron arm, eminently matched clash, and then the whole battle being resolved, entire fate of entire kingdoms to be resolved by a damn flank attack carried out by 50, 60 cavalrymen, crushing at the end of the day in that fashion armies of thousands, tens of thousands. That's real, right? That's how much it reveals you the positive object of the offense, right? A positive aim. So for now, actually, we stop and read this work, study it, because it's worth the world in a sense. Okay. Alright, for now, stop, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.